How did a 70-ton mass of modern engineering become a floating raft in the heart of New York City? Look closely at this scene. An Airbus A320 is drifting down the Hudson River, surrounded by freezing water, yet the passengers are standing on the wings, dry and waiting for rescue. It's an image that defies everything we know about aviation disasters. How did a sophisticated airliner, completely stripped of both engines at the lowest altitude in flight history, manage to pull off an impossible landing that every subsequent computer simulation labeled a death sentence? Was it a stroke of luck, or was it a miracle? In reality, it was neither. This is a precise mapping of 208 seconds, where every millisecond was a life-altering choice. This wasn't a miracle, it was a brutal, high-stakes calculation of physics executed on the razor's edge between life and death. At precisely 3:25 p.m. US Airways Flight 1549 began its departure from runway 4 at LaGuardia Airport. The conditions were cold but clear. For the first 2 minutes, the climb was standard, following a routine departure path over the Bronx. But at 3:27 p.m., the trajectory of this flight was permanently altered. At an altitude of exactly 2,818 feet, the aircraft struck a flock of Canada geese. These were not just birds, they were 12-pound masses of flesh and bone. At takeoff speeds, the kinetic energy of each impact was equivalent to a sledgehammer hitting the engine blades at hundreds of miles per hour. Both CFM56 engines ingested multiple birds, causing immediate, catastrophic internal failure. The sound was described by those on board as a series of loud thuds followed by an eerie, vibrating silence. In an instant, the Airbus A320 was no longer a powered aircraft. It had become a 70-ton glider. To understand the gravity of this situation, we need to look at the glide ratio. In a standard gliding configuration, an aircraft of this size needs to maintain a specific forward velocity to prevent a stall, but with no engines, every foot of forward movement comes at the cost of vertical altitude. The forensics are clear, they were losing height at a rate of roughly 1,000 feet per minute. Let's analyze the 3D mapping of the flight path. Immediately after the strike, the pilots had to make a choice. Here is LaGuardia to the south, and here is Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Look at the data. Turning back to LaGuardia required a 180-degree turn. Forensic flight simulations later confirmed that the bank angle required to complete that turn would have increased the stall speed and bled away the remaining energy too quickly. The math simply didn't work. Teterboro was closer in terms of a straight line, but at an altitude of only 2,000 feet and dropping, the distance was beyond the capability of a powerless airframe. Every available landing strip was mathematically out of reach. Inside the cockpit, the response was practiced and cold. There was no panic, only the rapid execution of emergency checklists. Captain Chesley Sullenberger immediately took control. His first move was critical. He reached up and activated the Auxiliary Power Unit, or the APU. In an Airbus, the flight controls are fly-by-wire, meaning they rely on electrical power to move the flaps and the rudder. Without the main engines, that power would normally come from a small wind turbine called a RAT, but it only deploys at high speeds. By turning on the APU within seconds of the engine failure, Sullenberger ensured that the flight computers stayed active, allowing him to maintain precise control of the aircraft's pitch and roll. While First Officer Jeff Skiles worked through the dual-engine failure checklist, attempting a restart, the aircraft continued its steep descent over the Bronx and toward the George Washington Bridge. The data shows they cleared the bridge by less than 900 feet. The sensors recorded no thrust from either engine. The restart attempts were futile, the cores were shredded and the internal components were decimated. As they moved south along the Hudson, Sullenberger made the final call. The river was the only unobstructed route. The target was a spot near the ferry terminals, where rescue would be fastest. The technical precision required for a water landing is extreme. You cannot hit the water nose first, or the aircraft will dive and disintegrate. You cannot hit wing first, or it will cartwheel. The data reveals Sullenberger maintained a steady glide at exactly 125 knots. The descent was relentless. As they approached the surface, the ground proximity warning system began to scream, "Pull up, pull up." At precisely 30:31 p.m., just 6 minutes after they had left the ground, the fuselage made contact with the Hudson. The pitch was exactly 11 degrees nose up. The deceleration was massive, pulling several Gs as the water acted like a brake against the metal skin. The impact was violent, but the angle was perfect. The airframe held together. The aircraft came to a halt, bobbing in the icy current. The flight was over, and everyone on board was alive. But as the passengers were being pulled from the water, a different kind of pressure was beginning to mount. The landing was a success, but the investigation was about to start, and the pilots were about to find themselves in the crosshairs of a system that believed they had made a fatal mistake. While the world was celebrating a miracle, the National Transportation Safety Board was building a case for pilot error. To the public, Chesley Sullenberger was a savior. But to the investigators, he was a man who had unnecessarily risked 70 tons of metal and 155 lives. Behind closed doors, the NTSB ran dozens of computer-generated flight simulations. The data they presented was cold and seemingly indisputable. Every single simulation showed that if the pilots had turned immediately after the bird strike, the aircraft could have returned safely to LaGuardia, or even made it to Teterboro. According to the machines, the Hudson was a choice, not a necessity. To the board, Sullenberger hadn't performed a miracle, he had ignored the math. He was being painted as a reckless gambler who chose the river when a runway was still within reach. But Sullenberger knew something the computers didn't. He looked at the investigators and made a single, pivotal request. He didn't ask for mercy, he asked for reality. He demanded that they include the human factor in their parameters. In the simulations, the pilots knew exactly what was happening the millisecond it happened. They turned the plane immediately. But in the real world, you don't just react like a circuit board. You have to process the shock. You have to analyze the failure. You have to realize that your engines are gone and your world has just changed. The NTSB agreed to rerun the tests, this time adding a 35-second delay to account for human reaction time. The result was a chilling silence in the room. Every single simulation that included those 35 seconds ended in total catastrophe. Some planes clipped the tops of skyscrapers. Others stalled and plummeted directly into the densely populated streets of the Bronx or New Jersey. The math that previously condemned him now proved he was right. Without that immediate, robotic response, the airports were an impossible target. It was a stunning revelation. The very hesitation the investigators were scrutinizing was actually the window of time where a human mind was weighing the lives of those on board against the lives of thousands on the ground. The machine perfection of the simulations had failed to account for the moral weight of the pilot's seat. It wasn't the fly-by-wire system or the flight computers that saved those people. It was a human's ability to pause, assess the impossible, and choose the only path that didn't lead to a massacre. This case permanently shifted the focus of aviation forensics, proving that sometimes the most critical part of the machine is the human heart making the decision. But this isn't the first time physics and human intuition have collided in the face of a water landing. To understand just how rare this success was, we have to look back at a moment where the water wasn't so forgiving. To truly grasp why the landing on the Hudson is considered a freak occurrence of engineering and luck, we have to move 13 years back in time, away from the skyscrapers of New York to the turquoise waters of the Comoro Islands. This is November 23, 1996. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961. A Boeing 767 hijacked and out of fuel. Just like Sullenberger, the pilot here had no engines. He had a clear view of the water. He had a wide-body jet. But unlike the Hudson, this event ended in a horrific disintegration captured on camera by tourists on a nearby beach. Why? How is it possible that one aircraft bobs like a cork while another shatters like glass? To find the answer, we have to look past the heroism and dive into the brutal, unforgiving physics of fluid dynamics. In the case of Flight 1549, the investigation focused heavily on the glide, but the real secret to survival lay in the moment of contact. Look at the telemetry of the Ethiopian flight. As the 767 approached the Indian Ocean, the left wing dipped just a fraction of a degree too low. In that split second, the physics of wingtip drag took over. At 200 miles per hour, water does not behave like a liquid, it behaves like a solid, unyielding anchor. The moment that wingtip touched the surface, the water grabbed it with a force of several 100,000 pounds. This created what engineers call a cartwheel effect. The aircraft didn't slide, it was tripped. The sudden, asymmetric drag flipped the 70-ton machine onto its back, snapping the fuselage into 3 distinct pieces and killing 125 people. Now, compare that to the Hudson. Sullenberger maintained a perfectly level wingspan. But even with level wings, there is a second, more dangerous variable: the angle of attack. Here is where the science refuses to cooperate with the pilot. To survive a water landing, you must hit the surface at an incredibly narrow window of pitch. For an Airbus A320, that magic number is exactly 11 degrees nose up. If you hit at 6 degrees, the nose digs in, the aircraft dives, and the water pressure crushes the cockpit. If you hit at 15 degrees, the tail strikes with such force that it shears off, opening the back of the plane to a catastrophic flood. Sullenberger hit the Hudson at precisely 11 degrees. A 1-degree error in either direction could have turned that miracle into a massacre. But there is a detail in this case that is often overlooked, a piece of engineering that acts as the magic bullet of this story. It's called the ditch switch. Look at the overhead panel of an Airbus A320. Among the hundreds of toggles is a single button labeled ditching. In the seconds following the bird's strike, as the pilots were working through their checklists, this switch was activated. What does it actually do? It's a command that overrides the entire ventilation system of the aircraft. It sends a signal to close the outflow valve, the emergency ram air inlet, the avionics ventilation ports, and the pack valves. It essentially seals the aircraft like a submarine. Without this switch, the Hudson landing would have had a very different ending. In older aircraft models, or in cases where the electronics fail, the fuselage remains open to the outside air. The moment the plane hits the water, hydrostatic pressure forces thousands of gallons through these vents. This leads to what is known as hydraulic lock, where the weight of the incoming water drags the aircraft down before the life rafts can even be deployed. The A320 stayed afloat for 24 minutes because of a few tiny valves closing in perfect synchronization. However, even with a ditch switch and a perfect angle, the controversy remains. Critics of the miracle narrative point to the structural damage. If the landing was so perfect, why did the rear of the plane take on water so quickly? Forensic analysis of the salvaged wreckage revealed that the floor of the cargo hold had actually buckled upward upon impact. The water didn't come through the vents, it tore through the metal skin itself. This brings us to a harsh, scientific truth that flight manuals rarely admit the human body and the aluminum airframe are not designed to survive the transition from air to water. In the history of commercial aviation, there have been hundreds of emergency water landings, or ditchings. But when you filter out the small bush planes and the light commuters, the number of successful, zero-fatality ditchings for large jetliners is effectively one, just one. This creates a glaring gap in aviation safety statistics. We are told that every seat is a flotation device and every exit is a life raft, but the physics of the perfect angle and the cartwheel effect suggest that these are often just psychological comforts. The Hudson was not a proof of concept, it was a statistical impossibility. It hinges on a series of ifs that defy the laws of probability. If the birds had hit a few seconds earlier, if the Hudson had been choppier, if the ditch switch had shorted out, any one of these variables would have resulted in the aircraft snapping like the Ethiopian 767. We like to believe that technology has made the world safe, that a button can turn a plane into a boat, and a pilot can master the elements. But the science shows us a different picture. It shows us an aircraft that was designed to fly, forced into an element it was never meant to touch, and a pilot who had to fight against a computer that didn't believe he could win. So, was it a miracle? Or was it just the one time the math actually worked in our favor? When we look at the twisted metal of the other flights that didn't make it, the answer becomes uncomfortably clear. The Hudson wasn't the start of a new era of safety. It was the ultimate exception to an almost universal rule of gravity and fluid force. And that brings us back to the final question. In a world governed by cold equations and rigid physics, what happens when the next flight runs out of sky? The conclusion of the Hudson investigation didn't just clear Sullenberger's name. It changed how we view the relationship between the man and the machine. It reminded us that while the computer can calculate the glide, it can never calculate the value of the lives in the back of the cabin. But the story of Flight 1549 is just one chapter in a much larger struggle to conquer the limits of engineering. To truly understand the future of how we move through the world, we have to look at the machines being built today and the secrets they still keep from the people who fly them. Ultimately, the events on the Hudson were more than just a sequence of lucky breaks. It was a definitive victory of human experience over the cold, rigid perfection of computer algorithms. A reminder that in the most desperate seconds, the human mind is still the most critical component in any cockpit. We produce original 4K 3D engineering animations with a small team of dedicated creators to bring these complex stories to life. So, please support us by subscribing and dropping a comment below. You won't want to miss our next exclusive analysis as we dive into the technical mystery of Flight MH370.